Let's talk about arguments for the existence of God today. Arguments for the existence of God come in many, many forms. Some of them are, of course, suitably unrealistic, suitably unconvincing, suitably uncompelling, that we're not going to look at them. But there are arguments for the existence of God that have played a strong role in intellectual history. Some of those include, say, Pascal's wager argument, an earlier version of which can be found in Al-Ghazali in the Middle Ages. That argument goes something like this. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. Place your bets. Bet that God exists and win, and you get an infinite reward. Bet that God doesn't exist and you're wrong, you get an infinite punishment. Now we're going to come back to that last claim later when we look at the problem of hell, but just go with the argument as Pascal lays it out. In between are cases where you bet that God exists and you're wrong. Pascal says you'll lose some vices, which is a good thing. Bet that God doesn't exist and be right. What's going to happen? Pascal again thought there was a mild negative repercussion for this because belief in God was supposed to make you a better person. The in-between elements in the decision matrix don't matter that much, though, because they're going to be finite. It's the other two extremes that are infinite. So no matter what numbers you put in the intermediate blocks in the matrix, doesn't matter. So that's Pascal's wager argument. And as I said, there's an earlier version of this in Al-Ghazali. It's also an argument that you hear from ordinary people quite a bit. This is not a philosopher's invention. This is something that lots of people resort to when thinking about what their major life commitments are going to look like. Here's another argument, arguments from religious experience and arguments from agreement. So the difference is religious experience arguments focus on the nature of particular kinds of experiences that people have of God, either really exotic, esoteric, mystical experiences of the sorts that are described by the great saints, but there's also ordinary, mundane religious experiences cited by other people. Plantinga, for example, talks about just viewing the majesty of a mountain and having that be a religious experience, or the incredible beauty of a meadow scene filled with wildflowers. And if you're attracted to Texas at all, you got to think about bluebonnets. You got to think about Indian paintbrush. They're beautiful. You can have those moments as purely aesthetic moments, but they can also be religious experiences of a certain sort. Arguments from agreement don't have to do with experience, but rather with belief itself. The vast majority of human beings have been theists, and some people think there's an argument to be made there for the existence of God. Now that sounds implausible on the face of it, but remember that there's a problem of disagreement. Sometimes people think the fact that others disagree with you gives you a reason to revise your opinion one way or another to accommodate the fact that sometimes the people that disagree with us are as smart as we are and have as good information as we have. Sometimes, call that pure disagreement. Sometimes there's disagreement with your superiors. In America, we like to pretend that we don't really have superiors, that everybody is equal. And there's some truth in the idea that all human beings are equal in some sense or other. as, say, a foundation for universal moral rights. But anybody who thinks everybody's equally smart, everybody's equally informed, is a bit confused. So let's say there's a problem of peer disagreement. There's also a problem of disagreement with your superiors, people that are better analysts about the data that they have, and people who have superior data. Well, if you think you're supposed to revise your opinion downward in the face of peer disagreement or disagreement with the experts, if you think that, then it's going to be a little bit hard to rule out the argument from agreement without even considering it. So there's an argument from agreement. There's also moral arguments for the existence of God. Some people think morality can't be taken seriously, won't have the seriousness that it in fact has, unless it is undergirded or grounded or explained by a divine being in some way or other. So one of the standard views of this is the divine command theory. Things are right or wrong on the basis of God's commands. Now, this view faces an immediate and serious objection, first described by Plato in the dialogue Euthyphro. It's called, not surprisingly, the Euthyphro Problem. The Euthyphro Problem is that you have to be able to answer the question, does God command what he does because it's right, or is what he commands right because he commands it? Think about the order of explanation. And whatever you do, don't go in a circle. Don't say things are right because God commanded them and God commanded them because they're right. We don't need to talk a long time about what's wrong with explanatory circles like this. It should be intuitively obvious. So let's let that point go. So what are we going to say? Does God command things because they're right, or are they right because he commands them? Now, underlying ethical monotheism, the kind of view that arose first in the Abrahamic traditions, is the idea that God is perfectly good, God is upright and just. There's no sensible reading of the Hebrew Bible that doesn't make this front and center when it comes to describing the nature of God. What is different, special about God is his uprightness, his justice, his righteousness. Well, that should lead you to think that, well, God favors things, God wills things, God commands things because they're right, because they're good. They don't become good or become right simply because of divine fiat. So that tells us perhaps there's an argument from morality to God, but you have to be careful because the Euthyphro problem raises serious issues that can't be avoided if you're going to try to make such an argument work. Finally, another major argument, is the argument from miracles. So when miracles happen, we're tempted to give supernatural explanations of them. Now, that argument has two key elements. One is, was it really a miracle, or was it just an unusual event? What's the difference between the two? We'll actually talk about that subject when we get to the metaphysics of theism. We'll talk about the nature of miracles and that sort of thing. We will talk there as well about David Hume and his rejection of the idea of miracles. In any case, the first premise is a miracle occurred, and that has to be defended. And to do so, you have to distinguish between miracles and other unusual events. Second, if there is such a thing as a miracle, how does our understanding of miracles require supernatural explanations? So if a miracle is just a novel and wonderful event, maybe it's compatible with the laws of nature and so there's no reason to give a supernatural explanation. In any case, the argument for miracles is another one of the arguments that we're not going to look at in any detail.